Imagine a world where the very cosmos is not only explained by numbers, but is bound together in harmony. Well, that world isn't some fantasy. That's the world that the three philosophers we're going to discuss today believed that we live in. Today, we'll step into the mind of Pythagoras, a famous philosopher that we actually know very little about, and Xenophanes, a poet-philosopher who was actually way ahead of his time. And lastly, Heraclitus, known as the Riddler. His words baffled even the wisest of Greek philosophers. By understanding their ideas, we're inching our way slowly closer to having a full picture of where we have been in philosophy so we can forge forward without ignorance. So join me as we dive into today's episode of The History of Philosophy. While we know much about the Pythagorean school, we actually know very little about Pythagoras himself. In fact, aside from a few mentions by Plato and Aristotle, we actually have very little evidence that he existed at all. This has contributed to significant speculation regarding Pythagoras and his school. Were the Pythagoreans simply mathematicians, or were they more of a cult? While the truth of that remains elusive, there is reason to believe that their school was not only about mathematics, but had a spiritual or religious component to it. One of his more famous beliefs was in the transmigration and reincarnation of souls. Legend has it that Pythagoras wanted all of his followers to be vegetarians because he believed that animals were our kin. While they could eat vegetables, they had to stay away from beans though, because beans, Pythagoras thought, contained the souls of the dead. A fascinating idea. And while these beliefs might lead some to think that the Pythagorean school was very primitive, their undeniable contributions to mathematics and science suggest otherwise. Up until then, mathematics had been primarily used in commerce. Pythagoras was one of the first people to extend mathematics beyond trade. The Pythagoreans developed a system of representing numbers using dots and triangles, placing particular importance on the tetractys of the decad, a triangle with 4 dots on the bottom, 3 on the row above, 2 above that, and 1 on top. A total of 10, which the Pythagoreans believed had mystical significance. Actually, it's from this method of visualizing numbers that we get the term figures in math. Of course, Pythagoras is most famous for the Pythagorean theorem. However, historians believe that the Pythagorean theorem was actually known by Thales and even in Egypt prior to Pythagoras' existence. It was likely that Pythagoras or one of his followers discovered the proof for the Pythagorean theorem, earning themselves credit and therefore the name to go along with it. Beyond mathematics, the Pythagoreans made significant contributions to the world of music. They discovered that the length of the vibrating string was responsible for the pitch. And by using numerical ratios, they discovered octaves, perfect fifths, and perfect fourths. The Pythagoreans were known for saying that all is number. This wasn't a literal claim, but a profound metaphysical statement. Remarkably, the Pythagoreans seemed to grasp that geometry and math was everywhere in the natural world. And in this way, all is number. Just think about a crystalline structure, for example. That's geometry. And in that way, Pythagoras was absolutely correct. But despite this level of brilliance, they weren't without their faults. When it came to irrational numbers, the Pythagoreans showed their more primitive side. They viewed irrational numbers as an evil force. Consider the square root of 2. Normally, the square root of a number is simply the value that, when multiplied by itself, equals the original number. But in the case of 2, the square root is not a whole number. As the legend goes, the Pythagoreans were so disturbed by this fact that they actually drowned the mathematician who discovered this. And the rest of them were sworn to secrecy, never to speak of irrational numbers. Between that and the beans, it's really amazing that they're responsible for the discovery of so many cosmological truths. The paradox there is astounding, to say the least. But perhaps the Pythagoreans' most important contribution to the history of philosophy was the idea of harmonia. They believed that harmony wasn't just something to be heard in music, but was a fundamental component of the universe. They believed that the state of harmony and balance was the ideal state of the universe. And it was from this concept of harmonia that the doctrine of the mean came forth. That's the idea that virtue lies in the middle between two extremes. Think of it like this. If you're too nice to people, they'll take advantage of you. If you're too mean to people, nobody wants to be your friend. So virtue lies somewhere in the middle, where you've got a spine and a backbone so you can protect yourself, but you're also kind and willing to help other people. While Pythagoras may be best known for the Pythagorean theorem, his work extended far beyond math. His ideas specifically helped shift philosophy towards the path of science, blending mathematical precision and metaphysical exploration. Though primitive at times, Pythagoras definitely left his mark on the history of philosophy. In the 6th century BC, among the wandering poets and philosophers, we find Xenophanes, a man who spent his 92 years of life traveling and writing verses on an astonishing number of topics. Xenophanes was an outspoken critic of the religion of his time. To Xenophanes, it was particularly absurd to worship deities who they ascribed human-like characteristics to. How ironic is it that there are these gods who are all-powerful and so far above humans, and yet they get portrayed exactly like humans, needing clothes and food and succumbing to emotional outbursts which caused earthquakes. He too spoke out and claimed that natural disasters were not the wrath of the gods, but instead they were physical phenomena that had physical causes that they could study. In this way, Xenophanes was another key figure of the pre-Socratics, who wanted to get away from myth and move towards logic, reason, and observation to understand the world. Xenophanes argued that if there was a god, he wasn't going to be one of the humanoid gods of myth. In fact, he thought that God might even be synonymous with the world itself. Xenophanes was among the first philosophers to posit that reality was one. This idea would later be fully embraced by Parmenides in his Eleatic School, a fascinating chapter of philosophy that we'll get to in another video. In fact, Plato considered Xenophanes to be the first Eleatic. Xenophanes believed in the pursuit of arete, or excellence. He thought that one could achieve excellence through deep philosophical discussion. For him, this was the highest form of inquiry. And in this way, Xenophanes became a key figure in the history of philosophy. If there's one way to get remembered in the field of philosophy, it's to say something so profound or so confusing that people don't stop talking about you for centuries. This is the legacy of Heraclitus, often called the obscure, the dark, and the riddler. Born around 540 BC into a wealthy family, as Heraclitus grew up, he started to ask deeper questions and eventually gave up his wealth to become a hermit. In time, he wrote a book, and when that book fell into the hands of Socrates, the great philosopher had this to say: "What I understand of it is splendid. What I don't understand of it is probably splendid too, but it would take a Delian diver to get to the bottom of it." Imagine stumping one of the greatest philosophers in history. Heraclitus wrote in a style that almost feels prophetic, much like Nietzsche's "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." Heraclitus' writing is vague, even confusing, partly because he used very little punctuation, but also because he would make vague statements, like this quote: "Nature loves to hide. The eyes are more exact witnesses than the ears." Does that suggest that it's better to see things with your own eyes than hear them as an account from somebody else? It's hard to say. Heraclitus also had a pretty big ego. He had no problem criticizing other philosophers. He claimed that most of the people engaging in scientific inquiry of that day had no actual understanding of the cosmos. He once said, "The learning of many things does not teach understanding. Otherwise, it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and again, Xenophanes." Just like that, he's calling out two of the philosophers that we just spoke about. In fact, Heraclitus believed that he was among the very few who actually grasped the correct logos, which at the time was synonymous with framework or theory. Part of this logos was the idea that the world was constantly changing. This idea that the whole world was in constant flux was so critical to his philosophy that one of his disciples was known to not even answer questions that people would ask. He would simply wag his fingers, shake his head, because by the time he could answer the question, he believed the whole world was changed. His answer was now outdated. Taken to this extreme, you would think that Heraclitus' view of the world was one of utter chaos, but that's not the case. Think of a river. The water flowing through it is always changing. Yet the river itself remains so because it has water flowing through it. This constant change isn't a defect or a disruption, but an attribute of both the river and the cosmos. Heraclitus also spoke about the unity of opposites. He gave an example that the way up is simultaneously the way down. He's even been quoted saying that the good and ill are one. Is he suggesting that the only way you can assign a value to an event that happens is through your interpretation, and that there is no objective good or bad? Another thing that Heraclitus considered to be an attribute and not a defect of the world was strife itself. He condemned that anybody should ever want the eradication of strife. This tension between two opposites was a necessity for existence. Can there be heat without cold? Can there be light without dark? And can there be good without evil? Like his pre-Socratic predecessors, Heraclitus believed in the arche. For him, however, the arche was fire. As he once stated, "The cosmos, which is the same for all, was not made by gods or men, but it was ever, is now, and ever shall be, an ever-living fire, parts of it kindling and parts of it going out. Fire is lack and abundance." Just as Xenophanes believed in the pursuit of excellence through rational thinking, Heraclitus was adamant that rational thinking was a virtue. He believed that we had an ethical duty to speak the truth and act on our understanding of the world. Very notably, Heraclitus appears to be one of the first philosophers to extend philosophy beyond cosmology and into politics and law. Though Heraclitus spoke in ways that even baffled Socrates, his words contained wisdom that would influence philosophers for generations. From Pythagoras' exceptional contributions to the world of mathematics and music, to Xenophanes' proposition that the entirety of reality is one, foreshadowing the future thoughts of Parmenides, to Heraclitus' mystical language that explored the realm of opposites. The ideas of these men set the stage for further philosophical development, which we'll continue to see in our next episode as we study Parmenides, one of my personal favorite ancient philosophers. That being said, I hope you've learned as much as I have in my studies of these philosophers, and that you'll subscribe and join me as we continue to study the history of philosophy. Have a great week.